Hey guys. Okay. So I'm going to experiment with this whole idea of once a day, most days, not every day, trying to pick one question from social media to answer. Uh, I got a little bit of a different setup here, trying to broadcast to multiple channels at once. So we'll see how that winds up working. Um, but Uh, actually, I want to experiment with posting something in the chat here. I'm using Restream. I've never done that. By the way, I'm answering a question on why would ferritin be low when iron saturation is high in a case of iron overload. That's what we're going to talk about today. Um, let's. All right. So it looks like some of you might have gotten a message of some links that you can support me with in the chat. Not sure which. I'm gonna have to look at how this happened later. Anyway, so this is a question from, and I'm gonna share my screen. So this is a question from Alexander Drazen on Twitter, and he's responding to a study that I posted of 28% of hemochromatosis patients have polycythemia, and of course these hemochromatosis patients are C282Y homozygous, which is the severe form of hemochromatosis. I personally happen to have homozygous H63D, which is the less severe allele. And I probably would never get diagnosed as having hemochromatosis, but if I don't donate blood, I feel like crap due to iron overload. And I was posting this study. In particular, I was interested in the why my red blood cells and hematocrit were recently high. And this goes back to first time I ever discovered this or had an inkling of it was in a microbiology class when I was an undergrad, where we measured our hematocrit. And it was, it was in the lab. It wasn't professionally done, but everyone's was normal, and mine was like 64% or something, which is considerably above uh, the top of the normal range, which is in the low 50s. Then later, when I was in grad school, I would often have to donate blood to the lab because everyone would give blood to the lab. We would mix it all together, and we would use it as control plasma. So we would have controls when we were running lab assays. If we were measuring a bunch of things in people's blood from a study, we would want to be able to control for batch to batch variations in the lab equipment by making sure we had a standard set of plasma that we ran in every single batch. And so we would generate that control plasma, we called it, by just pooling all of our blood together. And every time we would all donate blood to the lab, we would centrifuge it. And then my packed red blood cells were always at least 50% higher volume than everyone else's, or sometimes looked like double. And of course, I'm eyeballing it in the centrifuge tubes, but it still seems strange. And so I had a complete blood count when I kept finding that repeatedly, and my hematocrit was normal. My red blood cells were normal. So I dismissed it, but I probably shouldn't have dismissed it because they were probably only normal because I had been donating blood to the lab so often. And so what I was posting on Twitter was that I hadn't donated blood for a few years. Part of it was because I was busy. Part of it is because I get white coat syndrome. My blood pressure skyrockets when I get it measured, and I measure it at home and it's very, very good. But if I haven't gotten it measured for a while, I just get an anxiety response when someone else is measuring it. And so I got kicked out without being able to donate a couple times. And then COVID happened, and that kind of made me a year behind on everything. So anyway, recently I did an inside tracker panel that included a CBC, and my hematocrit was out of the range high, 55 or 56%, something like that. Red blood cells were at the top of the range. MCHC, which is the mean hemoglobin content of red blood cells, was elevated. And so I started looking for reasons why this might be, and I found this study that, these are C282Y, more severe form of hemochromatosis, but still 28% of them have diagnosable polycythemia, which is too many red blood cells. And polycythemia increases the viscosity of the blood and decreases circulation. So like polycythemia vera patients can have hematocrits up to the 80s, although you only need to have 55% to actually have diagnosable polycythemia, or as a component of other diagnostic criteria. But in the worst cases, they can get in the 80s for their hematocrit, and the circulation can slow by a factor of 2 to 3. And polycythemia vera, which is not hemochromatosis, that's a genetic elevation in red blood cell content, that's also associated with cognitive decline, and the cognitive impairment is relieved by blood donation. And so, I'm realizing one of the reasons I got interested in or found out about my iron status in the first place way back in the grad school days was not just that I was trying to figure out why my packed red blood cells were of greater volume. It was also because every time I had my blood drawn, I felt a little bit better. So I was generally feeling like crap. And every time I had my blood drawn, I would feel better. And the more blood was drawn, the better I would feel. And the crowning moment was, and I'd never donated blood, so I'd never given 500 milliliters at a time. So the crowning moment at that time was when I was a guinea pig for a catheter insertion for my lab mate who's doing a pharmacokinetic study. Pharmacokinetics is studying if someone takes a pill, those ingredients, where do they go? How much time does it take? Where do they circulate to? And so on. And in order to do a study like that, you have to take blood at many time points. And so her study involved taking 12 blood draws the first day and then having the person come back in the morning for a 13th blood draw. And so I was a guinea pig to help her practice. And to do this, she had to insert a catheter where instead of poking a needle 13 times in the vein, you just have the catheter inserted into the vein. Person keeps it there, and you just are able to draw blood out of the same needle, basically 13 times. And after that, I felt amazing. And so that, because my RBCs were normal at that time, I sort of glossed over the whole idea that my packed red blood cells were always so high and that my hematocrit had been high when I measured it myself in undergrad. And I found out that I was H63D homozygous for the less severe form of hemochromatosis through 23andMe, and I had an iron panel done. My iron saturation was high at 55%. The normal range is usually 20 to 50%, but if you look at the physiology of iron saturation, generally it should be 30 to 40%. So I consider 30 to 40% physiologically normal, even though the lab considers, you can't diagnose something because it's 42%. But from my perspective, if you get it back 42% and then next time it's 43%, next time it's 44%, you're on your way to 55% at some point. And so knowing that the normal physiology wants to keep transferrin saturation around 30 to 40%, I just consider that physiologically normal. And so I know that I feel like crap at 55%. If I donate blood, it goes into the 30 to 40% range. And so that sort of reinforces that for me, good iron saturation is also 30 to 40%. Now, if you get an iron panel, you're looking at iron saturation, which is, it's sort of like when you get like calculated LDLC, kind of. Transferrin's more expensive to measure. So what you're interested in is transferrin saturation, but you're using iron saturation as a calculated estimate of transferrin saturation. And what they do is they look at like how much iron is in the blood. So that's your serum iron. And then they say, okay, if we add more iron to the blood, how much of it sticks? Like add it in, wash it away, how much sticks? That's your unbound iron binding capacity. You can add that to the bound iron in the blood. That's your total iron binding capacity. That's UIBC and TIBC. And then from that, you can take the proportion of the total iron binding capacity that is bound, and that's your iron saturation. And that is an estimate of your transferrin saturation. But there are other things in the blood that can bind iron. The biggest one is albumin. So if your albumin levels are different, for some people, the transferrin saturation is not correctly reflected in the iron saturation, but in general, it works. And so anyways, Alexander Drazen asks in response to this question, he's H63D as well, asked me about phlebotomies, et cetera. But what I'm interested in answering here is this question. A lady friend, 44, has low ferritin and high iron and high saturation at 55. Have you researched such a combo? Thanks. And I said, generally, I would consider that an early stage iron overload. And he says, what makes her burn ferritin though? And so, so this is what I'm here to answer today. And in order to answer that, I think the easiest thing to do is to take a look at how iron is regulated through two graphics that I can show you. So share screen is awkward because as soon as I share the screen, it's going to make me look like, a bunch of mirrors facing each other. But okay, so the first thing I'm going to show you is from the book Modern Nutrition in Health and Disease. And this is showing the regulation of hepcidin. And hepcidin is a hormone that controls iron metabolism systemically. And you could think of it basically as the response to high iron levels that helps stabilize iron levels or bring them back down. And so what happens is you have transferrin circulating in the blood that has some level of iron binding sites, and some of them are bound by iron and some of them aren't. And as when you have transferrin that is saturated with iron, then this acts on transferrin receptors to do different things. So generally, the transferrin is going to bind to, or is going to interact with transferrin receptor 1. But as the saturation of transferrin increases, and this is sort of what happens during low or normal iron conditions in order to deliver iron to cells so that they can use it. And as the iron saturation increases, there is a protein, HFE, which is made by the HFE gene, which is accounts for 95% of cases of hemochromatosis when it's mutated. So that, if you've gotten a genetic analysis showing hemochromatosis, you have a mutation in this HFE gene. H63D, which I'm homozygous for, or C282Y, which is the more severe form, is a mutation in the in the gene that makes this protein HFE. And there is no genetic. So one side note, there are like 15 other genes that can be mutated that can cause hemochromatosis, especially the gene for this transferrin receptor 2. And but there are numerous other ones as well. And I don't know of any clinical genetic analysis that includes any of them. So, I got my HFE status from 23andMe for $100. I believe it's 200 now if you want the health reports. But you don't even need the health reports. You could just get the raw data file and look up. They actually have a video on YouTube how to know if you're vulnerable to iron overload or something like that. Just search my name and iron, and you'll get the instructional video of how to just get it from the raw data file. And so you can pay way more money than that. Maybe your insurance covers it for just getting the HFE gene. And they still don't measure any of the other dozen or so genes that can be mutated in the less common forms of hemochromatosis. So those genetic analysis can rule in genetic predisposition to hemochromatosis, but none of them can rule it out. Anyways, so what happens is when transferrin saturation increases, HFE causes the transferrin to move from interacting with the transferrin receptor 1 to transferrin receptor 2. And what that does is it shifts iron metabolism towards increasing the production of hepcidin, which is a hormone that reacts to high iron levels. And so remember, I was saying the normal physiological range of transferrin saturation is 30 to 40%. That's because um, below 30%, the preponderance of transferrin interactions are with transferrin receptor 1. And in high iron, if you get above 40%, the preponderance of those interactions are with transferrin receptor 2. And so this tug of war between low transferrin saturation, high transferrin saturation is going to cause responses mediated by the HFE protein coded by the HFE gene to increase hepcidin synthesis as you go up in the range from 30 to 40%, and then really step on the gas pedal on hepcidin synthesis above 40% and really sort of cut it off under 30%. So basically, you always have some hepcidin, but you're usually floating around the range between 30 and 40% transferrin saturation, increasing hepcidin or decreasing hepcidin in order to keep it in that range. And when you get above 40%, you're really stepping on the gas pedal for hepcidin synthesis. Now, hepcidin is basically going to decrease iron intake and increase iron storage in ferritin. And I'm not sure, off the top of my head, I'm not sure if hepcidin has a direct effect on ferritin, but it absolutely will have an indirect effect on ferritin. I'll show you why in a second. But basically, as transferrin saturation goes up between 30 and 40%, we kick in the homeostatic mechanism to keep iron levels down. And that's done by decreasing intestinal iron absorption and increasing iron storage in ferritin. Why would we want to increase iron storage in ferritin under those conditions? Because ferritin is not bad. Ferritin is protective against the effects of high iron levels. Now, that may seem odd to you when ferritin is always the thing that's measured as an index of how bad the situation is. But even if your ferritin level is 1,000, in which case, you're in big trouble. The ferritin being high is actually what's protecting you. So if you didn't have that ferritin, more of that iron would be free, and more of that iron being free would be contributing to more oxidative stress. And of course, at that point, you're just sort of depositing iron like a mineral deposit in your internal organs. So that's a problem too. A lot of that is stored as hemosiderin. And so, just taking up space with metal deposits is a problem. But the free ionic ferritin has the ability to convert superoxide hydrogen peroxide to the hydroxyl radical, which is a far more dangerous. I think I have that right. In any case, free iron increases the hydroxyl radical, which is one of the most dangerous free radicals there is, which causes enormous oxidative stress. So the job of ferritin is to stop that from happening. Now, inflammation also increases and so oxidative stress is an independent regulator of ferritin, because when you have oxidative stress, regardless of your iron levels, you want to sequester more iron in order to prevent it from making the oxidative stress worse by making more hydroxyl radical. Inflammation has an independent effect, increasing ferritin regardless of iron status, because iron feeds some pathogens. And if you have an infection, your inflammation is high. If your inflammation is high, your body thinks you have an infection regardless of whether you do. And on the basis that that might be an infection that is fed by iron, you store iron and ferritin to protect it from feeding pathogens. So basically, when your iron levels are high, you are not only decreasing iron intake, but you are increasing ferritin synthesis to protect that iron from feeding pathogens and to protect that iron from increasing oxidative stress. Okay, now, the other figure I wanted to show you is from this paper, Current Understanding of Iron Homeostasis. And what you can see here is that 90% of your iron is contained in your red blood cells. And those red blood cells are digested by macrophages. And so 90% of the iron in your body is going to find its way into a macrophage when red blood cells are broken down. So this macrophage iron content is a critical juncture in total body iron flux. And so the iron leaves the macrophage when the red blood cells are broken down through ferritin, so that it can be released and transferred in transferrin back into the bone marrow, where more red blood cell precursors are being made, so that the red blood cells get loaded up with iron-bound hemoglobin once again, and this endlessly circles. Now, you can see in the macrophage, if you don't export the iron through ferritin, then you will store the iron as ferritin inside these macrophages. And, ferritin is measured in serum. It's not measured in whole blood. So you're not measuring the ferritin inside the macrophage. And where ferritin in the serum comes from is actually subject to a lot of scientific controversy. But obviously, if you have a lot more ferritin intracellularly, you're probably going to get more serum ferritin as a result. So the normal function of the HFE gene is that if the iron saturation is getting high, you are increasing hepcidin synthesis and that is synthesized by the liver. And that hepcidin is going to act on the small intestine to prevent iron absorption. And that is by decreasing ferritin. And so the iron is coming into the enterocyte, which is where you absorb dietary nutrients, and it's being exported into the circulation through ferritin. And so if you decrease ferritin, the iron gets stuck in the enterocyte, probably mostly bound to ferritin at that point, but that doesn't become serum ferritin. Instead, every 2 to 3 days, these enterocytes fall off. They slough off, SLOUGH is the term for it, and they wind up in the feces. So the hepcidin is basically going to, iron levels go up, hepcidin gets rid of ferritin in the enterocyte, iron gets stuck in the enterocyte, bound to ferritin, and winds up in the feces. But hepcidin also decreases ferritin at the macrophage. And so the macrophage basically stores this now as ferritin. And somewhere, the ferritin that's stored, and of course, it's decreasing ferritin everywhere else. And so all ferritin is synthesized inside the cell. And so serum ferritin's got to come from some cell somewhere, regardless of the scientific controversy of where it's coming from. But hepcidin is, regardless of whether it has any direct impact on ferritin, is by decreasing ferritin, it is diverting the iron into ferritin intracellularly. And at some point, that ferritin, some of that ferritin, and by the way, this isn't just putting it in the ferritin, it's also increasing ferritin synthesis, because as intracellular iron levels rise, that is what causes more ferritin to be synthesized. And so regardless of whether the ferritin is even bound to the iron in the serum, under high iron conditions, you're just going to have more ferritin synthesized inside cells, and somehow that gets into the blood as serum ferritin. So remember, this is normal, right? Normal high iron status with a normal HFE gene causes hepcidin that decreases iron uptake in the intestine, so you don't absorb as much, and increases the storage of iron as in ferritin, largely in these macrophages. And that ferritin protects the increased amount of iron from feeding bacteria and from fueling the flames of oxidative stress. Okay, so now let's go back to the other figure. Oh, didn't mean to do that. I think I went forward too much. Yeah, this one. Okay, so remember, the HFE gene that's mutated in hemochromatosis is what allows you to, as you go up in transferrin saturation, to turn on hepcidin to decrease iron intake and to increase ferritin. So if the HFE gene is mutated and it does not work correctly, as in H63D or C282Y, what happens? Well, as transferrin saturation goes up, you don't get this shift to transferrin receptor 2 speaking to hepcidin to turn it on. So you continue to absorb more dietary iron, which increases transferrin saturation even further. But because you don't have the hepcidin, you don't get rid of ferroportin. You don't stop iron from being exported from macrophages. You don't cause iron to accumulate in the cell to turn on ferritin synthesis and be stored by ferritin. So if the HFE gene isn't working, transferrin saturation goes up, and the ability of high iron levels to increase ferritin synthesis goes down. Okay? So hemochromatosis mutations cause you to make less ferritin than you should be making. Less ferritin, not more. So how do you get more ferritin in an advanced case of hemochromatosis? Simple. Because you're not decreasing iron absorption from the intestines, then you are increasing iron everywhere in the body. And even though you are not engaging in hepcidin synthesis properly to increase the storage of iron inside cells, you still have more iron everywhere, including inside the cells. And so the iron overload itself will increase ferritin. But not only that, because you have less ferritin than you should have, you have per iron atom, you are getting more oxidative stress. And that oxidative stress is going to increase ferritin even further. So in a certain sense, ferritin is like the fireman, but when HFE gene is working correctly, the fireman shows up on time. When the HFE is like the fire alarm. So when the fire alarm doesn't go off, the fireman still comes. It's just that the fireman might come when the house is already burning down. The fireman might come when, people inside the house are dying, right? So it's early stage. I would imagine from this that in everyone who has the first physiological response to a defective HFE gene, what you see is transferrin saturation is high and ferritin is low, because at this point you are disrupting the communication that turns on ferritin and turns down iron uptake. But because it's an early case, you haven't accumulated total body iron levels or enough oxidative stress and the combination of the two to massively increase ferritin. So when ferritin is outside the reference range, and when ferritin's 1,000, you're looking at something that's been playing out for decades at that point, where serious damage has been done by the time it's caught. So if we go back to that question, what makes her burn ferritin, though? It's not that she's burning through ferritin. It's that in the earliest case, remember, this is a female, so she's protected by menstruation. She might have genetic predisposition to hemochromatosis, but she might be a couple decades behind a man in iron accumulation due to the protective effect of menstruation. And so even at 44, this would be a pretty early case in terms of the physiological sequence of events. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that ferritin is low. Now, granted, the ferritin could be low for some other reason, but it's actually exactly as I would expect in a very early case of iron overload, because the mutation in the HFE gene is a breakdown of the communication between high transferrin saturation and hepcidin, which is what shifts iron into ferritin. All right, so I hope that explains that. Let me see if there's anything going on in the chat. Catherine Spihar says, this is an amazing story. Thank you. I'm glad that, sorry. My screen was still sharing. Okay. All right. So if you enjoyed this, I'm going to try to do it. Probably not going to do it 30 minutes a day, but I'm going to try to hop on here occasionally, answer some questions as time permits. And um, it would be great if you could support my work in any way possible. I'll post some affiliate links and product links in the description if you want to support my work. I would greatly appreciate it. Also, if you go to chrismasterjohnphd.com and you go to purchase support, there's a support page there with many, many different ways to support my work. So that's all I got for you today, guys. Hope that was useful.